Hi, everyone.
Hi again. We're in Genesis chapter 18,
Yes,
starting at verse 16, is it?
16 to 21. When the men got up to leave, they looked down toward Sodom, and Abraham walked along with them to see them on their way. Then the Lord said, "Shall I hide from Abraham what I am about to do? Abraham will surely become a great nation, a great and powerful nation, and all the nations on earth will be blessed through him. For I have chosen him, so that he will direct his children and his household after him, to keep the way of the Lord, by doing what is right and just, so that the Lord will bring about for Abraham what he has promised him." Then the Lord said, "The outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah is so great, and their sin so grievous, that I will go down and see if what they have done is as bad as the outcry that has reached me. If not, I will know."
Well, we certainly want to address that point, that there's the grievance against God a lot of the time. It's either God is too slow or God is too judgmental.
Yeah.
And this time it appears that the outcry is that God, you're too slow. But we'll deal with that in a minute. I think the more important at the first is to see the prophetic role that Abraham and his offspring are put in here. Mm-hmm. We haven't had the word prophet yet used in the Bible, but here you have the prophetic principle in verse 17. Yahweh said, "Shall I hide from Abraham what I am about to do?" Mm-hmm. And there's the role of prophecy. This nation, obviously, has fulfilled that in the almost 4,000 years since these words were first spoken.
And later he is called a prophet, right?
He is called a prophet in the account about Abimelech a few chapters on. Mm-hmm. But this idea that election is about favoritism is obviously discounted by this, because it's not. It's about God appointing someone to do a certain job in the world.
So 19 says, "I have chosen him," but the purpose is so that he will direct his children and his household in the way of the Lord. Mm-hmm. And then because we're told in chapter 12, he'll be a blessing to all nations, that ends up being a blessing to us too. Because he starts with them learning the way.
Yeah.
And then later it becomes the means by which the rest of the nations learn.
So when God makes these unconditional promises, Abraham shall surely become a great and mighty nation, we've just read in the previous two chapters, mm-hmm. He's going to make more nations out of Abraham, but this nation, the nation coming through the chosen seed, mm-hmm. Isaac then Jacob, this mm-hmm. nation is going to be a great and mighty nation, and all the nations of the earth shall be blessed in him, or mm-hmm. by means of him. So that thought, that's what election is really about. It's about the means by which God is going to transmit blessing. Mm-hmm. And we look at the history of Israel and we think, well, what a failure. Most Jews not only didn't believe the prophets, but didn't believe Jesus when he came. No, but the nation's still around.
Yeah.
And that's what's funny when I think about my own history and look back to the 1960s when I was growing up in Toronto. Mm-hmm. I was surrounded by Jewish influence and didn't realize it. Most of the music I listened to was somehow connected to the Jews. Most of the movies I watched were somehow connected to Israel. In my hometown, Toronto downtown, the most prominent hardware store, the bargain store everybody went to all over Metro Toronto, was
Honest Ed's.
Ed Mirvish, who later became very prominent in the theater world in Toronto mm-hmm. through his family, and mm-hmm. Sam Shopsowitz, Shopsy's Hot Dogs.
Mm-hmm. And then Sam the Record Man.
Sam the Record Man, my favorite record store. All of it, and I didn't think much of it at the time. My best friend when I was a young man, 8 or 9 years old in Toronto, just come from England, was Jewish. Mm-hmm. And my brother's best friend was Jewish. We lived only a mile away from the center of what I later found out was one of the biggest Jewish communities in the world.
Yeah. In
downtown Toronto.
Mm-hmm.
But all of that was hidden from my eyes. The point is that all of this that God says he's going to do through Abraham's offspring is going to take a lot of time.
Yeah.
And that's where God gets himself in trouble, right?
So that's why when Paul talks about the Jews, he says they were entrusted with the oracles of God.
Mm-hmm.
You know, that's the blessing to the rest of the world. And we still are receiving that blessing. That's why we have the Old Testament, because they preserved it.
And why they're still around, those Jews, even unbelieving Jews. So, yes, it does supply fodder or ammunition, as it were, for the unbeliever. And why is God so long in bringing justice to the world? Well, the outworking of this purpose.
Yeah, and I think the thing about this one, more often you get criticism of Sodom and Gomorrah being destroyed, God judging, is criticized. But what do you do with the fact that it says here that there's been an outcry that has reached God? So who's doing the outcrying?
People who are suffering.
And that would be maybe their neighbors, and certainly the children in those communities would be suffering.
Mm-hmm.
So God can't win. You know, if he delays, we're mad at him. If he acts, we're mad at him.
Obviously, the flood had already happened thousands of years before this.
And he waited till there was only one man then, and he still gets criticized.
And we know the way it works out in this very chapter is God says, well, if you can find 10 righteous men in Lot, I will spare the city.
The whole city, yeah.
I also find that the principle of accommodation is very clearly here in that last verse. I will go down to see whether they have done altogether according to the outcry that has come to me, and if not, I will know. How comfortable are we at this stage with a God who doesn't know everything?
Yeah.
So you could understand that God is admitting he doesn't know everything. He's learning like we are.
Or you can understand that he is accommodating his infant, Abraham, at the time. So he's trying to make it so he understands.
Yeah.
That's a possibility too. Have we ever thought of that? Or are we still thinking every word has to mean exactly that?
They're coming from a polytheistic background. All of these people, including Abraham. And what's the essence of polytheism but that you think God is limited? And God has to accommodate himself to your scope of understanding. So the idea that God is omniscient and omnipresent doesn't occur to man naturally.
And it certainly wouldn't be yet that's even come into any focus.
And there's still people who don't believe that God is
Well, the Watchtower doesn't believe it, so they haven't got around to it.
Yeah, here we are 4,000 years with the whole Bible in front of us, and we still don't believe God, if we're witnesses, and a lot of other people too.
Is more than just a big man in the sky.
He's more powerful than we are, but he's not got the attributes that classical Christianity ascribes to God. And I wouldn't just say classical Christianity, I'd say the book of Jeremiah. Kings, when Solomon is preaching at the inauguration of the temple, he is preaching to people who still in their heads and hearts are pagan.
Yeah.
And so he has to say that God is here and God is there.
But by the time you have David, who seems to realize that God is bigger than people would give him to be, from his Psalm 139, and Solomon too.
Yeah.
Can a temple hold you? Like they're starting to get it.
Jeremiah has to say it again, though, at the exile. 400 years later, he still has to say, he has God saying to Israel at that point, am I a God nearby and not a God far away?
Yeah.
Because they can't think of God being both.
Yeah. The scope of God is hard for the natural mind to understand.
So all of this is very human language, like you just said, is the way a parent talks to a child.
Yeah.
Yeah. And much of that in the Old Testament. And we had a link too.
Well, we were going to read some quotes.
Yeah, let's read Gunther Plaut. Now, I had heard of Gunther Plaut. He's a Jewish scholar, a Jewish rabbi. I didn't realize that till much later he had written Bible commentaries, because I knew him from the Toronto Press when I was a kid. So this is his contribution to the Torah, a modern commentary, Gunther Plaut on Genesis. And here he's talking about Sodom and Gomorrah. No parallels in extra-biblical literature exist to the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, yet the destruction of the cities is referred to so frequently in the Bible that only historic cataclysm of startling proportions could have impressed itself so deeply on popular memory. The cities most likely stood near the south end of the present Dead Sea, where today's Sodom is situated. The district is filled with bitumen and salt formations and is part of a deep rift that reaches from Armenia to Central Africa and that runs north-south through the Araba Valley. The rift is presumed to be the result of a catastrophic earthquake which might have raised the level of the Dead Sea sufficiently to flood what was formerly the Valley of Siddim. That's referenced in Genesis 14 verse 3, looking like the Garden of Eden in those days. Mm-hmm. And to submerge the cities. So it should be said that this is written about 50 years ago. So since then, you can access on YouTube a lot of later information about the archaeology of that region. Mm-hmm. And it seems that it's starting to tilt now towards Sodom and its related cities being at the north end of the Dead Sea, where the Jordan River empties into it. Mm-hmm. And you had Nahum Sarna, another non-Christian Jewish scholar, right?
Mm-hmm. He says, the Hebrew words translated here, outrage and outcry, are really one and the same. The identical description is repeated as the disaster approaches. For we are about to destroy this place, because the outcry against them before the Lord has become so great that the Lord has sent us to destroy it. That's chapter 19, verse 13. This thrice repeated, generalized designation of the Sodomite sin as an outcry appears to the English reader to be a rather mild appellation, hardly commensurate with the enormity of punishment. But this is one of those instances in which a Hebrew word cannot be adequately translated into another language. In the course of its linguistic metamorphosis, the force of the original has become vitiated. The Hebrew root, and then he gives you the Hebrew root, indicates the anguished cry of the oppressed, the agonized plea of the victim for help in some great injustice. A few examples of the Hebrew usage will suffice to illustrate the degree of poignancy and pathos of moral outrage and soul-stirring passion that pervades the Hebrew word. God heeded the outcry of Israel in Egypt against their taskmasters. If any mistreat a widow or orphan, God will heed the outcry as soon as they cry out, and his anger shall blaze forth. That's Exodus 22. To Isaiah, an outcry is the very negation of justice and righteousness. And then he quotes Isaiah 5:7. And he looked for justice, but behold, bloodshed. For righteousness, but behold, an outcry. The book of Job castigates the wicked who cause the outcry of the poor and afflicted to come before God. The outcry of Sodom then implies, above all, heinous moral and social corruption, an arrogant disregard of elementary human rights, a cynical insensitivity to the suffering of others. Mm-hmm.
So we might not get the power of that Hebrew expression. He's saying we definitely don't get it in English because there's no exact equivalent, but the idea of agony anyway is built into it, right?
Yeah.
So how long has that agony causing the outcry been going on before God actually goes down to the city? Mm-hmm. We can't be sure. It could have been hundreds of years, at least generations. Mm-hmm. And the link we're putting in is...
we had one, Babel, let us go down. Who is us?
Yeah. There's another example of what we would have to view now as accommodation. Mm-hmm. Let us go down.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
See you next time.